The wheelchair hadn't moved in 3 hours. Stacy knew because she'd been counting. Standing at the floor-to-ceiling window of the 72nd floor penthouse, Seoul's skyline bleeding neon into the dark below her, she'd been counting every breath, every minute, every reason this wasn't her life. Behind her, silence. She could feel him. That was the worst part. She could feel the weight of his gaze cutting across the room like a blade through silk, even though he hadn't spoken a single word since the ceremony. Not one. The man they called the broken dragon of the Kong syndicate, paralyzed, mute, a ghost propped up in a chair while his empire ran itself, and yet somehow the air around him felt like a held threat. Her red slip caught the city light as she turned to face him, just to check, just to remind herself he was still there. He was still seated, still... The wheelchair was empty. The soft click of a lock turning made her spin toward the door. He was standing, 6 feet of controlled, devastating stillness, his white dress shirt hanging open at the chest, black ink tattoos curling across muscle that had no business existing on a man who hadn't walked in 5 years. His dark eyes found hers across the room, and they were not the eyes of a broken man. They had never been. He took 1 step toward her, then another. "You're shivering," he said, his voice low, unhurried, the kind of voice that had spent years learning the power of being withheld. Stacy's hands flew to her mouth. The man she had been sold to wasn't broken at all. She had been in the middle of a presentation. Stacy Minnick, senior brand strategist, youngest director in her firm's history, a woman who had clawed every single rung of her career with her own 2 hands, had been standing in a glass-walled conference room with a laser pointer and 47 slides when her phone lit up with her grandmother's name. She'd ignored the first call, and the second. The third time, something cold moved through her chest and she stepped out. "Grandma B, I'm at work." "Come home, baby." A pause that lasted too long. "Tonight. There are things your daddy should have told you a long time ago, things that can't wait anymore." She drove the 3 hours to Macon in a silence so thick she couldn't find the radio station. Her grandmother met her at the door with red eyes and a mahogany box that looked older than Stacy's entire life. Inside, a document, a photograph, and a name, Kong Seong Hoon, written in ink so dark it looked burned into the paper. 17 years ago, Grandma B began, her voice barely above the hum of the kitchen light, your father made a choice. He thought he was saving a stranger's life. He didn't know that stranger was the heir to the most dangerous family in Seoul. She pressed her weathered hands over Stacy's. And the Kong family never forgot a debt. Stacy stared at the photograph. A man in a wheelchair. Broad shoulders, jaw like carved stone, dressed in black. No expression. Eyes forward, as if the camera, as if the world, was barely worth acknowledging. They're not asking for money, her grandmother continued quietly. They're asking for you. A blood oath. 17 years dormant. And activated the moment her father's business failed, and the Kong syndicate decided it was time to collect. Stacy was the alliance, the transaction, the peace offering wrapped in a wedding dress. She had 48 hours to be on a plane to Seoul. He can't even speak, one of the syndicate's representatives told her the next morning, sliding a briefing folder across the table with the casualness of a man scheduling a meeting. He won't bother you. Think of yourself as... He searched for the word. Essential staff. She almost laughed. Essential staff. She had given up her career, her apartment, her entire life, to become a glorified caretaker to a silent man in a chair. She told herself that was the worst of it. She was catastrophically wrong. She had been sold to the most dangerous man in Asia, and he had been waiting for her. Subscribe to see how this unfolds, and comment below telling me where you're watching from. I would absolutely love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is already traveling. The call came on a Tuesday, which felt wrong. Catastrophic things shouldn't happen on Tuesdays. They should arrive on stormy nights, or at least on a Monday when the week already felt like a threat. But it was a Tuesday afternoon in Atlanta. The sun was doing something beautiful over the skyline, and Stacy Minnick was in the middle of the best presentation of her career when her grandmother called 3 times in a row. She drove to Macon with her blazer still on and her laser pointer still in her bag. Grandma B met her at the door looking smaller than Stacy remembered, the way people shrink when they've been carrying something too heavy for too long. She didn't say hello. She just took Stacy's hand and led her to the kitchen table, where a mahogany box sat between them like a confession waiting to be made. Inside, a document with a seal Stacy didn't recognize, a photograph, and a name handwritten at the bottom of the page in ink so dark it looked scorched: Kong Seong Hoon. 17 years ago, her grandmother began, your father made a choice. The story came out slowly, the way old pain always does, in pieces, with long silences between them. Her father, younger and reckless and working a shipping contract in Seoul, had pulled an injured man from the wreckage of what he'd believed was a car accident. He hadn't known the man was heir to the Kong syndicate. He hadn't known the accident was a hit. He'd simply acted, gotten the man to safety, and walked away without asking for anything in return. The Kong family, however, had written it down. A blood oath, 17 years dormant, filed away like a loaded weapon waiting for the right moment to fire. That moment arrived the week her father's company collapsed under a debt he'd never fully explained to anyone. The syndicate sent a representative to Atlanta within 72 hours of the bankruptcy filing. They weren't asking for money. They were asking for Stacy. She sat very still while her grandmother talked. She'd always been good at that, holding herself together in public, falling apart only in the privacy of her own chest. She looked at the photograph while the words washed over her. The man in it was seated in a wheelchair, dressed in funeral black, his white shirt buttoned to the collar. His shoulders were broad enough to suggest a body that had once been built for something violent. His face was unreadable in the specific way of men who had trained themselves out of expression entirely. His eyes looked directly into the camera as though daring it to find something worth photographing. He can't speak, the syndicate's representative told her the next morning in a hotel conference room that smelled like carpet cleaner and finality. He slid a folder across the table without looking at her. He hasn't since the incident. He requires medical oversight, routine care, and a legal next of kin for the Kong Group's international holdings. A pause. You have the credentials, the education, the discretion. He finally looked up. Think of it as a placement. Stacy thought of quite a few other things to call it. She had 48 hours. Her father's life, the quiet, specific guarantee of it, depended on her answer. She packed one suitcase, told her firm she had a family emergency, and did not cry until she was somewhere over the Pacific with the cabin dark and no one watching. Seoul received her like a city that didn't need to impress anyone. The Kong estate was 40 minutes outside the city center, behind a gate that required 3 separate clearances to pass through. Stacy counted the security cameras from the car window. She stopped at 11 and decided the number wasn't going to comfort her regardless. The mansion itself was modernist and severe, more fortress than home, built from pale stone and dark glass that reflected the sky without letting anything in. She was shown to a sitting room and told to wait. He came in silently, which she hadn't expected. She'd imagined the sound of wheels on hardwood, something to announce him. But the floors were carpeted in the main hall, and the first she knew of Seong Hoon's presence was the shift in the room's atmosphere, a drop in temperature that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. She turned. He was already watching her. Up close, the photograph hadn't done justice to the contradiction of him. The wheelchair looked almost incongruous beneath a body like that, shoulders that filled the frame of the doorway, hands resting on the armrests with a stillness that felt deliberate rather than passive. His white shirt was open one button at the collar, and she could see the edge of dark ink beginning at his chest, the suggestion of something vast and intricate beneath the fabric. His face was angular, composed, and entirely closed to her. He didn't speak. He didn't nod. He looked at her for exactly 5 seconds. She counted those too, and then redirected his gaze to the window as though she were a piece of furniture that had been arranged to his mild dissatisfaction. A woman in a gray suit materialized at Stacy's elbow and began explaining the household schedule in accented English. Meal times, medical appointments, the wing of the house that was hers, the wing that was not. Stacy listened and watched Seong Hoon from the corner of her eye and understood, with the particular clarity of someone whose options had all just closed, that this was her life now. The wedding was 4 days later, traditional in every visible way, the ceremony, the silk, the careful choreography of a union being performed for an audience of syndicate elders who watched from their seats with the attentiveness of people assessing a transaction rather than witnessing a marriage. Stacy wore ivory and kept her spine straight and her face neutral, the same expression she used in boardrooms when the men around the table underestimated her. Seong Hoon sat at the altar in his wheelchair and said nothing. The officiant spoke the vows. An interpreter relayed them. Stacy repeated what she was told to repeat. Seong Hoon's responses were given by a proxy, a legal formality, she was told, standard accommodation for his condition. She slid the ring onto a hand that didn't move toward her or away. She felt the eyes of every person in that room cataloging her reactions, measuring her composure, filing their assessments away. Specimen, she thought. They're all looking at me like I'm a specimen. When it was done, there was no kiss. There was applause that sounded like business being concluded. There was champagne she didn't drink and a dinner she didn't taste, and a car that took them to the penthouse in silence, so complete she could hear the city 40 floors below them, like a foreign language she'd never been taught. The penthouse was cold and immaculate, and lit by the glow of Seoul at midnight. Stacy stood at the window because it was the only thing to do. She had changed into the slip she'd packed, deep red, chosen in some earlier version of tonight when she'd thought defiance might be a useful armor, and she told herself she was looking at the skyline because it was beautiful, not because she couldn't bring herself to look at the man behind her. She counted his silence in minutes. At the 47th minute, she heard something. Not wheels, not breathing. A sound so quiet, she almost missed it. The soft displacement of weight shifting, the almost imperceptible creak of the floor, taking on something it hadn't been carrying before. She turned. The wheelchair sat empty by the window. The lock on the door turned with a click that seemed to echo in every bone in her body. He was standing 6 feet away, his shirt hanging open at the chest, the full geography of his tattoos visible now. Black ink spreading across muscle in patterns that looked ancient and deliberate, like a map of every war he'd survived. He wasn't leaning on anything. He wasn't unsteady. He stood the way mountains stand, but with the particular authority of something that has always been exactly where it is. His eyes found hers and didn't move. "You're shivering," he said. His voice was low and unhurried and terrifyingly steady, the voice of a man who had stored it somewhere safe for years and was now choosing to spend it on her. Stacy's hands flew to her mouth. He crossed the room in the time it took her heart to stutter twice, stopping close enough that she had to tilt her chin up to hold his gaze. He didn't touch her. He simply looked at her with those unreadable eyes and waited, as if he had all the patience in the world, as if he had been waiting for considerably longer than tonight. "How?" she started. "Sit down," he said, not unkindly. "I'll explain once." She sat on the edge of the bed because her legs made that decision for her. He remained standing, and she understood instinctively that he'd needed her to see that, needed her to understand the full scope of what she was only now beginning to witness. He'd been walking for 2 years, talking for 3. The wheelchair was a stage, the silence a performance. The broken dragon a story told specifically to make his enemies stop watching him carefully. Men who believed they'd already won stopped guarding against the person they'd defeated. Traitors inside the syndicate had grown comfortable. His father's allies had started maneuvering. Every person who needed to reveal themselves eventually had, because no one fears a man who cannot stand. I needed someone inside this house who wasn't already part of the lie, he said, watching her process this with those patient, measuring eyes. Someone intelligent enough to play a role without being told every reason for it, someone who wouldn't— A pause, the first hesitation she'd heard from him. Break. You chose me, she said. It wasn't a question. She was already assembling the edges of it, the way her mind always worked fastest when the stakes were highest. This wasn't just about my father's debt. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The suggestion of one, held back by whatever discipline had built the rest of him. The debt was a door, he said. You were the reason I opened it. The city pulsed 40 floors below them, indifferent and enormous. Stacy sat in her red silk in a penthouse at the top of a world she hadn't chosen, married to a man who had chosen her with more calculation than anyone in her life ever had, and felt the strange, vertiginous sensation of the ground shifting beneath a version of herself that no longer quite fit. She was not a nurse. She was not a prisoner. She was not a transaction. She didn't yet know what she was, but she was beginning to suspect that finding out might be the most dangerous thing she'd ever done, and for the first time since Atlanta, that thought didn't feel entirely like a threat. The Park family sent their message on a Wednesday morning, which told Stacy everything about how seriously they took the Kong name now. She was returning from the covered market 2 blocks from the estate, a small freedom Seong Hoon had permitted, one of the few, when the black car pulled alongside her on the narrow street. 2 men got out without hurry, the particular unhurriedness of people who had never needed to rush because the world had always moved out of their way. The taller one smiled at her with his mouth only. Mrs. Kong, he said, tasting the title like something he found amusing. The Park family extends their congratulations on your marriage. We hope your husband's condition— A pause waited with performance— isn't too great an inconvenience for a woman of your ambitions. Stacy held her bag and kept her face exactly as still as Seong Hoon had taught her, by example, without a single lesson. Tell the Park family I appreciate their concern, she said, and their punctuality. Wednesday is such a specific choice. The man's smile didn't waver, but something behind his eyes recalibrated. He stepped closer, close enough that she could smell his cologne and the threat beneath it. A wife without a real husband is a vulnerability, he said quietly. We'd hate for you to feel unprotected. She became aware, at precisely that moment, of a black SUV parked at the end of the block that had not been there when she left the estate. The engine was running. The windows were dark. She couldn't see the driver, but she felt, with a certainty that had no rational source, that whoever was inside that vehicle was exercising the most extraordinary restraint of their life. I've never needed protecting, she said, and walked back to the estate without looking behind her. That evening she found Seong Hoon at the window, standing as he always stood when they were alone in the penthouse, or the wheelchair pushed to the corner like a prop waiting for its next performance. He didn't turn when she came in, but the quality of his stillness changed in the way she'd learned to read over the past weeks, the way you learn to read weather. You know what happened, she said. I had eyes on you the entire time. His voice was even. His hands at his sides were not. She noticed the way his fingers had closed, not quite into fists. Some muscle memory of violence imperfectly suppressed. The SUV was yours, I know. She set her bag down. You almost came out. A long pause. No. Seong Hoon. Another pause, this one different in texture. It would have been premature, he said finally, which was not the same as saying no, and they both understood that. She didn't push. She was learning when not to push. She found the scars by accident, 3 weeks into what she'd started privately calling their arrangement, the careful choreography of their days, the performance of her role as devoted caretaker, the reality of their evenings that looked nothing like it. He'd come back to the penthouse with a cut along his ribs that he'd clearly intended to manage himself, And he'd clearly miscalculated, because when she came out of the kitchen with her tea, she found him shirtless at the bathroom mirror with gauze he couldn't reach the angle for. "Sit," she said, in the voice she used when she wasn't asking, and to her ongoing private astonishment, he sat. Up close, the tattoos were a revelation, vast and intricate, black ink mapping his torso in patterns that she'd begun to suspect weren't decorative. Symbols she didn't recognize, formations that looked almost like coordinates, like records. She worked quietly, cleaning and dressing the cut with the medical supplies she'd learned, by necessity, to keep organized. Her hands were steady. Her mind was not. The oldest scar was low on his back, beneath the tattoos rather than integrated into them, the kind of scar that predated everything else on his body. Surgical, precise, the kind left by someone who knew exactly what they were doing and had done it deliberately. "The night of the hit," she said, not quite a question. He was quiet long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "I was 26. 3 men, 1 location. Someone inside the syndicate sold the information." His voice was the same as always. Low, controlled, giving away only what he'd decided to give. "The bullet didn't paralyze me. The surgery did. A choice made in the operating room by a surgeon loyal to my father's enemies, designed to finish what the hit had started without leaving evidence." Stacy's hands went still. "A man pulled me out of the car before the second shooter could reach me," Seong Hoon continued. "An American. He didn't know what I was or what he was interrupting. He simply," the briefest pause, "acted." Her father, standing at a shipping dock in Seoul 17 years ago, not knowing he was pulling the future head of the Kong syndicate out of an assassination attempt, not knowing he was signing a debt that would one day become his daughter's life. "You could have told me this from the beginning," she said quietly. "You wouldn't have believed it from the beginning," he said, which was true, and they both knew it. She finished dressing the wound in silence, but the silence between them had changed again, was always changing, always finding a new register, a new depth. When she moved to step back, he caught her wrist, not hard, just present, the way a question holds before it's spoken. "Your father is safe," he said. "He has been since the week you arrived." She didn't trust herself to respond. She left her hand in his grip for 3 seconds longer than she needed to before she stepped away. The chairman arrived without announcement on a morning when the sky over Seoul looked like a verdict. Kong Jae-won was 70 years old and moved like a man who had never once in his life been made to wait. He came into the penthouse's main room with 2 guards and the particular energy of someone who had decided in advance how the conversation would end. He looked at Stacy the way people look at invoices, briefly and only to confirm the amount. "She's decorative," he said to the room, in Korean, apparently indifferent to whether she understood. She understood enough. "And useless. My son has produced nothing, demonstrated nothing. The syndicate is asking questions and I have no answers because there is nothing to answer with." He finally looked at her directly. "You will be relocated. A smaller property. We'll find another arrangement for Seong Hoon that doesn't require—" "No." One word, from across the room. The chairman turned. Seong Hoon was standing. Not in the doorway. I'm not using the frame for support. Standing in the center of the room with his full height and the full terrible composure of a man who had been waiting years for this specific moment and had rehearsed it in none of the ways that showed. His wheelchair was behind him. He didn't look at it. The chairman's face moved through several expressions too quickly to name before settling into something that might have been, in another man, fear. "Seong Hoon, you will not relocate my wife." His voice filled the room the way rooms are meant to be filled, completely and without apology. "You will not speak about her value or her function or what she has or hasn't produced for this family." He walked, steadily, slowly, each step a sentence, toward his father until they were close enough that the guards shifted and he stopped them with one look. "I have been watching this family for 3 years, Every traitor, every realigned loyalty, every conversation held in rooms people assumed I couldn't enter because I couldn't walk. A pause that landed like weight. I can walk. I could always walk. And I know everything. The chairman was silent. Touch her, Seong Hoon said quietly, and I will burn every alliance you've built since the night someone tried to take my legs, starting with yours. The guards looked at the chairman. The chairman looked at his son. In the long, recalibrating silence that followed, something shifted in the architecture of the room. Some transfer of gravity, irreversible and complete. Stacy stood very still and felt, for the first time in months, like something other than a transaction. What came after was not simple, but it was hers. Seong Hoon needed the Kong group to survive daylight, to exist in the legitimate world convincingly enough that the syndicate's enemies couldn't use its shadows against it. He knew how to dismantle enemies. He did not know how to build a brand that made civilians trust you. Stacy did. She spent 6 weeks in a glass-walled office 3 floors below the penthouse, working with the legal and financial architecture of the Kong group the way she'd always worked, systematically, brilliantly, and with the focused energy of someone who had finally found a problem worthy of her. She restructured the public-facing businesses. She built a communications framework. She created a narrative around the Kong name that was true enough to hold and polished enough to survive scrutiny. Seong Hoon reviewed her work in the evenings. And the evenings had begun to run later and later, the distance between them across the desk narrowing the way distances do when 2 people stop pretending they're not aware of it. "You're better at this than I anticipated," he told her one night, which from him was the equivalent of a standing ovation. "You anticipated wrong," she said, and he almost smiled. She'd catalogued every almost, each one a small, private landmark, and she turned back to her work feeling something warm move through her chest that she wasn't ready to name yet but was done pretending wasn't there. The Park family called a summit in the 3rd month, which meant they'd run out of patience and were preparing to move. They expected a wheelchair. They expected silence. They had built their entire strategy around the premise of a broken man. Seong Hoon walked into the room. No chair, no interpreter, no performance, just the full, standing, unhidden reality of him. The tattoos visible at the open collar, the posture of a man who had long since made peace with how dangerous he was, the dark eyes moving across the assembled faces of the Park syndicate with the calm efficiency of someone crossing names off a list. The silence in that room had a texture Stacy could feel from where she stood at the back, behind the Kong group's representatives, dressed in black with her hands still and her chin up, and her heart doing something loud against her ribs. The head of the Park family said nothing for a very long time. Then Seong Hoon spoke, in Korean, low and precise and final, and she didn't need the translation to understand the shape of it. She'd learned to read him by then. She knew what a closed door sounded like in his voice. Whatever the Park family had planned, they were already too late. He found her eyes across the room when it was over, the way he'd started to do in rooms full of people, a private punctuation mark, a small claimed thing that belonged only to their particular frequency of understanding. She held his gaze and felt the last of the word prisoner dissolve off her skin like something she'd never needed anyway. She wasn't a captive. She wasn't a nurse. She wasn't a debt being paid. She was the woman standing beside the dragon when he finally breathed fire, and she had helped him remember how.